Good evening. Today I will be talking about the Federal Reserve and how it negatively affects the American economy. I will start with a brief history of the creation of the Fed and the reasoning behind its establishment. Then I will go on to the Fed's effects regarding inflation and how it affects competition throughout the economy. In 1907, a severe financial crisis prompted Congress to establish the National Monetary Commission, which created the Federal Reserve Act. Congress passed the act, and President Woodrow Wilson signed the act into law on December 23, 1913, to provide for the establishment of Federal Reserve banks, to furnish an elastic currency, to afford means of rediscounting commercial paper, to establish a more effective supervision of the banking industry in the United States, and for other purposes. My main point would be to define the term elastic currency. It refers to the bank's ability to expand money and credit as much as they want. Now they can inflate without limit and have a centralized institution to bail them out. That is, they are printing money. The St. Louis Federal Reserve Branch posted the adjusted monetary base from April 2008 to April 2009. It shot up from $856 billion to $1.7 trillion. Was there any new wealth created? No. Any new production? No. It's simply the printing press at work. This new money now sits as reserves in bank vaults, awaiting a safe environment for lending and borrowing. Should that environment arrive, we will see a level of price increases none of us, especially I, have ever experienced. One of the key functions of the Fed is to print money. Inflation is the natural outcome of such printing. On November 21, 2002, Ben Bernanke stated before the National Economics Club that by increasing the number of US dollars in circulation, or even by credibly threatening to do so, the US government can also reduce the value of the dollar in terms of goods and services. We conclude that, under a paper money system, a determined government can always generate higher spending and hence positive inflation. The risk for hyperinflation is getting more and more pertinent for America. This brings us back to 500% inflation during the Weimar Republic, where money was used to fuel houses. The American Institute of Economic Research did a study on the purchasing power of the US dollar. The goods and services you could buy for $1 in 1913, that is, before the Fed was established, now cost nearly $21. In other words, the purchasing power of the dollar has fallen to less than 5 cents of the 1913 value. It might be said that banks have stolen 95 cents out of every dollar. Secondly, I'd like to mention how competition is negatively affected by the Federal Reserve. As I mentioned initially, banks now have an institution to bail them out. The banking industry would thrive with competition once the too-big-to-fail notion is gone. Loan operations would take a much more realistic account of risks, and capital would not be as easily put out. Deposits would be safer, as banks would compete with one another to preserve the wealth. In 1912, Ludwig von Mises wrote a theory of money and credit. He warned central banking could worsen and spread business cycles rather than eliminate them. The central bank can reduce the interest rate and buy government debt as an asset on its balance sheets. This toys with the signal that the banking industry is sending to borrowers. Businesses then choose to take longer terms and start unsustainable projects. Investors flush with new cash put the money into stocks or buy homes. This creates a buying-selling fever similar in the past several years. It essentially creates a false boom. Thomas Paine, the writer of Common Sense, observed in the late 18th century that paper money threatened to turn the country into a nation of stock jobbers. As we see today, America has outsourced its manufacturing, and a large amount of profits come from investing and speculation. Not only do we lose competition in the banking industry, a lot of other industries fail during this boom-bust business cycle. If there was sound money, that is, money backed by something and not artificially created, then these boom and bust periods would be much less severe. In conclusion, it is evident that the Fed prints money, which causes inflation. This inflation could reach a toll never before seen in American history. Competition is destroyed not only in the banking industry, but across all industries. The Federal Reserve negatively affects the American economy, and we should end it.
All right, the proposition is, well, it's clear what your point is, although the phrasing on it is not as declarative as it ought to be. The structure of the supporting points is laid out pretty clearly. Your internal signposts were not as clear during the presentation. Most of your ideas are explained pretty clearly, so we understand what the assumptions are for the positions that you were talking about. Some of the evidence that you have, you've got some analysis of past trends in spending. I'm not sure that all of that evidence explains all of the reasons, for instance, that the value of the dollar has changed substantially in the 100 years that we've talked about. And I think it's a little bit conclusionary on that particular point. You discussed the issue of hyperinflation. You're citing some pretty old illustrations to demonstrate that, and you've got the one example about the Weimar Republic and the 500% inflation that was going on at the time. You need to talk a little bit more about how the conditions of our current spending, or our production of money, I should say, reflect the same kinds of patterns that were going on then, so we could see that in fact they are comparable and make the inference that you're trying to make. Let me see. I think you need a little bit more proof on that superinflation argument then. At the end, you were talking about the boom-bust cycle and how that, in essence, becomes the economic cycle that we're operating on. And I think you need to show how the cycle that we are currently in is going to change and create this inflationary pressure. Maybe some historical comparisons, for instance, to the amount of actual value in the money versus the extra printed money that we have. I know that you're talking about sound monetary policies. Let's say, for instance, we return to a sound monetary policy. What would the value of the money be at this particular time? I think that's something that could be explained a little bit more. At the end of the speech, though, you seem to be making a policy claim instead of a claim of argument. Instead of a claim of fact. Long day. I'm probably mumbling too much right now. I can tell. I'm having a hard time understanding myself. So you want to be careful about falling into making a policy argument instead of just the claim of fact that you're supposed to be doing here. All right. Thank you.